I would like to dedicate this presentation to Frau Hildebrandt, my high school German teacher. Her energy and tenacity during my period in high school fostered my love of German language and culture, and she was an exceptional person. From 2007 to 2012, professors Brooke Fisher-Liu, Suzanne Horsley, and later publications Abby Blake Levenhus proposed and empirically validated the first theoretical model to understand how the public sector environment affects the practice of government communication. Their model was built on U.S. federal government practices. That was unique because it was different than nonprofit and private sector communication models. The model, called the Government Communication Decision Wheel, presents a well-developed and widely cited theory of government communication decision-making in a field with few other models. Liu et al.'s wheel uses unique public sector environmental characteristics to explain government crisis communication decision-making and stance choices. Their theory states that attributes in each environment of the wheel constrain government communicators' communication decision-making. The wheel, pictured here, presents 4 different microenvironments, each with the same 8 attributes, which you see on the right. Each attribute in each environment can exhibit different levels of constraint. So you're talking 8 times 4, or 32 different levels of constraint. Understanding the attribute constraints in each environment can inform how stakeholders successfully interact with government communication decision makers. Liu et al. Recommended future research using their wheel look at non-US contexts, particularly non-democratic governments. I have borrowed this image from the Pew Research Center to picture today's non-democratic governments. The existing literature in our field generally calls for testing crisis communication theory in other environments, as non-Western crisis communication studies are rare. Variances in environmental factors in different types of governments may influence the applicability of theories in different countries, especially social, cultural, and cross-cultural variables. In Western democratic governments, crisis management hinges on responsible behavior, and crisis communication is designed to inform populations and demonstrate government accountability. This communication is used to discursively shape popular perceptions of the government to preserve power through mass media agenda setting. Unlike Western democracies, dictatorships shape stakeholder perceptions through control of mass media and all other public life. Their officials operate with different social, political, and cultural norms than Western democratic counterparts, which influence their communication practices. These officials are rarely or never required to be responsible to a general electorate. They are neither accountable to nor interested in informing their populations to respond to threats in a crisis. Dictatorships come in different flavors. Modern dictatorships, as defined by Jürgen Koka, are ideal for testing the government decision wheel for differences in a non-Western, non-democratic environment. Koka's definition highlights those characteristics that explicitly contrast with modern liberal democratic constitutional states. In his definition, a modern dictatorship is marked by the systematic violations of rights, open or thinly veiled rule by a single party and a narrow circle of leaders. They may demonstrate hegemonic claims of an institutional ideology. They may lack demarcated limits to state power. They may lack social subsystems. A party or the state may claim complete control of the economy, society, and culture through bureaucracy, propaganda, repression, and mobilization. Researching government decision-making in a dictatorship requires access to decision-makers and their information. So, rhetorically, I ask you, which of the fine gentlemen pictured on this slide should I ask for access to their information on classified decision-making? Dictatorships provide neither access to their government documentation nor allow interviews with officials or others about sensitive matters. However, the records of the former German Democratic Republic, or GDR, were made available to researchers by government of the Federal Republic of Germany, or the FRG, as you see notated on the map on left, in 1990 through the Federal Commissioner for the Records of the State Security Service of the former GDR. It's a mouthful, especially in German. Or in German, the acronym is the BSTU, which is what I'm going to use from here on out. The GDR was one of the most efficient, politically stable, and repressive modern dictatorships. In the 1980s, it was run by an inner circle of 4 people, led by General Secretary Erich Honecker, who is number 1 in the picture on right, and the Minister of State Security, Erich Mielke, who is the number 2 in the picture on the right. The GDR ceased to exist in 1990. It is now the eastern half of the FRG. The picture on left shows the 2 countries and their former borders for those not familiar with 20th century European history. The documents of its Ministry for State Security, also called the Stasi, reflect and report the Stasi's thinking and decision-making and that of other GDR government actors in choosing communication stances and strategies in response to crises. They are considered a highly reliable resource because of the Stasi's military discipline and record keeping. Right about now, you may be asking, Karl, what relevance does the study of the crisis decision-making of a deceased GDR state, a puppet of a defunct Soviet empire, have to do with current government crisis communication theory? Well, I'll tell you. The BSTU has noted that analysis of the Stasi files provides an opportunity to understand the GDR and other similar dictatorships by examining how the GDR functioned. My dissertation uses these documents to test the explanatory power of Lew and Horsley's theory in the context of CCS making in the GDR modern dictatorship, and whether Lew and Horsley's government communications decision wheel has explanatory power to uncover the constraints on how modern dictatorships make crisis communications strategy. If it does, it would in turn allow outside governmental and non-governmental actors who oppose modern dictatorships to use the theory to develop more effective transnational activist messaging policies, to pressure these governments through nonviolent means to change their behaviors towards their own people and their neighbors. There are many modern dictatorships still around today, as represented by all the yellow countries on the map on the left, as reported by World Population Review. The GDR was half of a divided country held in a state of suspended conflict. Similar modern dictatorships are important to Western foreign policy and exist today. See the blue stars on the map. These include Taiwan and mainland China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea, and more recently, the Russian and Ukrainian-controlled portions of Ukraine. Diasporic peoples from modern dictatorships also attempt to influence their home countries from the outside. Examples of those important to Western foreign policy include Afghanistan, Iran, Cuba, China, Russia, Venezuela, and Vietnam. See the red stars on the map. Finally, the Stasi collaborated with security forces of today's dictatorships, including those of Cuba, Angola, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Nicaragua, Syria, Yemen, and Vietnam, as well as the Soviet precursor to the Russian FSB. See the lines on the map. Perhaps you recognize the face of the example at the lower right. Yes, indeed, that is Vladimir Putin's Stasi ID card. Security forces of other countries were trained by the Stasi's College of Law, although from which countries are not clear because many of those records were destroyed. The only one we can actually confirm is Cuba. Understanding how subsequent generations of collaborators and trainees think may also improve communication effectiveness. The tyranny of time and money limits my access to BSTU files. So what's a poor graduate student like me to do? In 2013, the BSTU released a portfolio of Stasi documents concerning GDR communication related to crises associated with musical performances of West German rock star Udo Lindenberg and his Panic Orchestra, pictured on the left, in an album cover. In the FRG, Lindenberg is considered a national treasure and a rock legend. See his star on the German Walk of Fame, middle picture. He has been recognized twice with the German Federal Service Cross for, quote, speaking out, thinking differently, and overcoming borders between people, countries, and worlds in the East and West, end quote. See image on right. Lindenberg's musical rhetoric was known for its appeal to freedom, self-determination, and anti-wall message. For those not familiar, that would be the Berlin Wall dividing Berlin. These themes explicitly conflicted with the GDR's vision of a single German people under socialism. Lindenberg's music was therefore viewed as threatening to the socialist state. He and his band were tracked by the Stasi starting in 1976 when he started to gain some popularity in West Germany. In January and February 1983, Lindenberg's special train to Pankow, the RARD television broadcast of which is pictured on the left, was broadcast by radio in the American sector and other influential West German radio and TV stations. Its widespread popularity with GDR youth created a reputational challenge for the GDR government. Its lyrics were considered a defamation of GDR General Secretary Erich Honecker's character. The Stasi treated this as a crisis, warranting a communication strategy and response. Lindenberg regularly strove not to be co-opted by the FRG government and media as pro-Western. Instead, he wanted to constantly, quote, meddle and cause constructive worry, end quote. He actively collaborated with anti-nuclear weapons peace movements and the FRG's Green Party, which was considered an outlier party at the time. In October 1983, the GDR used Lindenberg and his band to promote its own transnational anti-NATO missile crisis communication in Rock for Peace, pictured on right, where he's being interviewed for television about his opinions. This effort backfired domestically with East German youth and GDR party leadership because of Lindenberg's association with his special train to Pankow and other earlier anti-wall rhetoric. I used the BSTU file of Stasi documents of this crisis communication history, along with the broadcast recordings and GDR newspaper archives, to test the applicability of the wheel within the GDR dictatorship. These are my research questions. Research question 1, does Lindenberg's case history support the microenvironments and attributes of a hypothesized GDR government communication decision wheel? Research question 2, does Lindenberg's case history support the constraint levels of a hypothesized GDR government communication decision wheel? And research question 3, did hypothesized high and moderate attribute constraints on Stasi and inner circle communication strategy impact contingent organization public relations choices? We'll talk about COPER in a little bit. Lew and Horsley criticized contingency theory because it hypothesizes factors that primarily affect private sector public relations during conflict resolution because it generally lacks parsimony. I used their own Professor Ching's less complex contingent organization public relations communications theory developed in a government context as an alternative, or COPER. Heath, 2013, recommends thinking about organizational public relations as the relationships an organization has with other organizations and constellations of stakeholders. The Stasi files identify relationships with other stakeholders, providing context for organizational power relationships and processes. These were relevant to my considerations of social political influences. Rosenthal and Kuzmin, 1997, add the human to the analysis of organizational political components in crisis. They suggest participant perceptions can concur or differ based on the perceived necessity of response due to an individual's subjective viewpoint. The Stasi documents identify individuals by name, and their individual perceptions were included in my analysis. Boyne et al., 2005, build on Rosenthal and Kuzmin's works by observing that decision meaning making are politically driven and require tasks for government decision makers. My GDR historical review and coding of document authors and recipients allowed identifying and including the political thinking of these stakeholders. Lindelof and Taylor, 2011, note that government documents are generally reliable, must be understood in the context of contemporary events, and include research on the marginality. I reviewed the context surrounding the documents and also coded their marginalia. I examined the levels of U.S. constraint in the wheel's 8 attributes in foreign environments on the top left against historical summaries of GDR public administration and political communication. Yes, I actually read real books, see the bottom left, to hypothesize parallel attributes and constraint levels of a GDR wheel, bottom center. I then examined historical events surrounding the case history to give context to the Lindenberg information, top center, more books. I tested the hypothesized GDR wheel attributes and constraint levels against the available Lindenberg case history data for consistency, see top right, including an example of one of the documents with marginalia. Finally, identified linkages between GDR wheel constraints and moments where Stasi inner circle contingent organization public relationships changed in the case history. See the bottom right. I reviewed the extensive 1970s to 80s GDR historical literature to saturation for evidence of Lew, Horsley, and Levenhus's 8 environmental characteristics, 4 microenvironments, and their constraint levels in the GDR from 1983 to 1984. I used qualitative deductive coding of the Lindenberg primary materials for evidence of GDR wheel's 8 environmental characteristics, etc., as I define them, as well as Ching's Cooper types. Leach and Olweg-Buzik suggest that qualitative coding is particularly useful for addressing process-oriented questions like decision-making. Saldana recommends using multiple coding techniques. I iteratively coded the decision processes in the material in multiple ways, as pictured at right. Huang et al., Ching and Cameron, and Leach and Olweg-Buzik point out that qualitative research needs to be conducted in the context of process and practices within specific situations. I also deductively coded in the context of Rosenthal and Kuzmin's larger DDR 1980s social, political, and cultural influences, as well as Lew et al.'s communication and public administration themes. Fulbrook has observed that all historical documents are artifacts of particular motives as well as situations. They are written for certain audiences and should be interpreted in that way. Lindelof and Taylor observed that document analysis is also useful for exploring document origins and history, issuance, and how they are circulated or read, and how they are used in communication action. I therefore also inductively coded Lindelof and Taylor's document characteristics and context for other relevant evidence. I coded all the information in Vivo, a computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software application, to create data and metadata for analysis. All the GDR wheel attributes, environments, and constraint levels actually appeared in the Lindenberg case history data. The microenvironments of the U.S. wheel fit the GDR extremely well. The attribute categories also fit well. The only exception was federalism, which was reversed in the GDR context and might better be termed centrism, reflecting an extreme degree of centralized control by the inner circle and the Stasi in each environment. The constraint levels of each attribute on the inner circle and Stasi communications were very different, as reflected in red on these charts, which I'm not going to go into now. The data supported the low constraints hypothesized in the wheel for the GDR's media, legal, management team participation, management team support, and federal or centric attributes in most environments. This provided the Stasi a different range of organizational communication strategies that democratic governments can employ, including legal revisionism, social forces, quotes, the Germans called it, police action, and the threat of physical harm. The Stasi served as a centralized crisis management team for the GDR, directing courts, schools, artistic performances, youth organizations, journalism, visa policies and tourism, and law enforcement to enact crisis communication strategies. It was a highly integrated and relied on two-way communication to efficiently and consistently enact communication strategies. The sociogram reflect the lack of choke points and communication restrictions within the Stasi operational system. However, while the Stasi controlled channels of communication, communist social political norms constrained inner circle and Stasi response choices. These included high constraints on multi-level decision-making. Inner circle direction could be downward directed in one way. The imperative for the inner circle to perpetuate political claims to rule party and government functionaries drove them to frame and respond to all opposition as expressions of the class enemy, steered by the imperialist capitalist West, especially the FRG. This highly constraining political viewpoint was drilled into party functionaries through professional development and Stasi enforcement of the GDR's unconstrained centric version of compliant federalism. The effort to combat hostile negative influences constrained the reception and use of feedback from lower levels of government outside the inner circle. This data suggests the inner circle was not constrained by party complaints. In some cases, it simply drove participation through its own tight-knit group of loyal followers within the Stasi, instead of using the larger Stasi crisis management machine. At the same time, the inner circle had no intention of compromising its own ideological beliefs to get what it wanted and only used Lindenberg as convenient. The need to appear consistent, if not compliant, with the human rights guaranteed by the Helsinki Accords drove the Stasi to attempt to control everything Western media, especially West German media, might see, and everything their own media was allowed to say. This was especially evident during Rock for Peace, Lindenberg's Rock for Peace in East Germany, where the data reflects high constraints from foreign media scrutiny and moderating constraints of legal frameworks like the Helsinki Accords, which guaranteed human rights for East Germans. In the Lindenberg case history, the inner circle and Stasi chose to maintain competing or neutral relationships, which are reflected in the Koper chart on the left, with many of their primary publics. Unable to escape from the high constraints imposed by their closed political worldview and top-down directive process, the inner circle and Stasi repeatedly chose a competing stance, far left, with their own people and Western and domestic media to respond to transnational messaging crisis. They relied on existing, well-rehearsed organizational paths of unconstrained repression and refutation through enforced management support and management team participation, well-practiced professional development, enabling legal frameworks, and a centric integration to rapidly execute responses. This is consistent with Boyne et al.'s observations that government communication practitioners typically manage crises by using pre-existing techniques and approaches because they are the easiest to execute quickly. These competing, far right, responses were the only responses permissible within, far left, responses were the only responsible permissible within a highly constraining worldview that saw all opposition as an assault by politically motivated imperialist hostile negative forces driven by the West. Our own NC State Professor Wiley has noted that the very idea of a nation state is socially constructed and is constantly challenged by globalization trends, including mass communication. This was especially true of the GDR. Inner Circle and Stasi competing stances were constrained by external media coverage of events related to the Helsinki Accords. To legitimize the existence of the GDR, the Inner Circle Stasi had to resist the negative, hostile globalization challenges of the Helsinki Accords while trying to appear to comply with them in a globalizing mass media. Foreign media scrutiny highly constrained their responses. They also sought to codify and control what domestic and foreign media could see and hear within the GDR by threatening journalists. They did so to avoid an international transmission of coverage contradicting the Helsinki Accords. During Lindenberg's Rock for Peace performance, the Inner Circle also assumed an evasion stance far left of the chart, with party membership and Stasi national staff, while assuming a neutral stance middle of the chart, with Lindenberg in order to use him. They ignored criticism and complaints from other party members and organizations, including other Stasi departments. This evasive stance, far left, reflected high constraints as the Inner Circle used politics, their management support, and their inclusion in the management team in the multi-level environment to affect their policy desires. Current crisis communication theorists, including our own NC State Professor Ching on this call, identify competing, evading, and neutral stances and strategies, or the left side of the chart, as less than effective. This is especially true in the external environment where national government control cannot be absolute. At the same time, the institutionalization of these practices within the GDR government also made them easy for the Stasi to use, and therefore most likely to be implemented. The microenvironments, attributes, and constraints of Liu et al.'s government communications decision wheel, as modified for the GDR, may adequately explain the reasons for crisis communication strategy and choice of COPR stances in at least that, or one, modern dictatorship. Some of the wheel's attributes and constraints in the GDR CCS making differed in fundamental ways from their operation in Western democratic systems. These differences explain unique communication channel affordances and intractable constraints in GDR CCS, or crisis communication strategy, and COPR choices. These intractable constraints promoted selection of communication stances which current theorists identify as less than effective. Limitations of my research. Qualitative research, especially a review of a single case history, by itself does not establish the reliability of a GDR wheel. Further repetitions of testing using other case histories are required to triangulate the dictatorial government communication decisions wheel and its predicted reliability. The single study available may have provided results which may not be replicable for a variety of reasons. For example, the Lindenberg BSTU files might include selective depositor survival of documents. Gary Bruce observed that the Stasi managed to burn far more documentation than remains. Then there is the ability to find relevant documents in a mostly paper-based system of Stasi records dating from the 1980s. You have to go through mountains of files to find anything. There may also have been a selective release of documents by the BSTU in the portfolio I used of the Lindenberg case history, so the editors may have had an influence. Archivists have noted omissions in GDR newspaper archives due to destruction or loss of the printed materials. The newspaper database I used may have been missing key issues. Finally, qualitative research also benefits from multiple qualified perspectives. The same tyranny of time and money prevented me from engaging other German speakers with background qualifications and availability to participate in my coding process. Additional coders working to consensus may or may not have yielded other results, as my own experiences, theoretical perspectives, values, and human limitations certainly influence my coding. I appreciate your interest in listening to all that, and I am open for questions.